Welcome to the Morning. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ellen Miller. How's it going?
It's going great.
It's going great.
It was a great cheer.
It's a great cheer. I was going to say, I always invite the speakers that you can bring them home later tonight if you want all of them. The only problem is you have to buy up their startup.
Really? They all come home? It's a group thing. Huh?
Sure, yeah. So, actually, you live up to your role. I've heard that you're one of the biggest disruptor for politicians in D.C. In fact, we were supposed to have Mayor Gray here in April, but we had to postpone him, and you disrupted him. I mean, you were. So, anyways, I thought it was funny.
It's actually one of the nicest things that you can say about me. I love the notion of being a disruptor. It may be the second best thing. Once I was described as famously obstreperous.
Right.
I like that too.
Yeah.
I like that too.
Actually, you did say that in the past video, but I had to look it up on the internet. I was like, what is that word?
I had to look it up the first time.
Sure. So we always like to start off on a personal note for these interviews. So if you can talk about where you're born, where you're raised, and then perhaps talk about your first entrepreneur experience or social endeavor as a child or a teenager. So let's start with you.
So I am a native Kentuckian. In fact, I just came back about 10 days ago giving a presentation as a native Kentuckian. I was raised in a town about 40 miles south of Louisville, a town called Bardstown in Nelson County, Kentucky. It was a town of 5,000 people. I'm a small town woman. I spent my high school years in Louisville, and then I left for the East Coast. And other than regular family visits and continuous arguments with Senator Mitch McConnell, I really don't have that much to do with Kentucky. I love it. I think it's a great place.
You root for the Louisville basketball team? That was March Madness.
This family of mine, we are Kentucky basketball fans.
Okay, got it.
So that's a faux pas. So there are a lot of sort of split families in Kentucky, but we're Kentucky basketball fans.
So if you talk about like your first maybe social endeavor that you've done.
Yeah, I was thinking about the answer to this question, and I was raised in a fairly, I would say, non-political household. My father and his brothers started their business, so they were business entrepreneurs. And I would say that I didn't actually have, or I don't think of having had a major sort of early social entrepreneurship kind of thing. But for me, that experience really came through a political awakening. And I was basically came to my political, attitudes during the 60s. And there were a number of mentors that I had who, sort of helped me figure out what was going on in that time. And it was really more of a political awakening, which indeed has shaped the vision of most of the work that I've done for my whole life.
So can we talk about maybe the first set of businesses or businesses that you had started, and how did that help you finally, create Sunlight Foundation? So let's talk about, your first two nonprofits that you worked on.
Well, even before that, some of my early experiences in D.C., I worked for Ralph Nader when he was, a really very, very important nudge. And as I said to Ralph, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, which is the last time I've actually seen him, I learned a lot from you, as a 22-year-old intern toiling for $50 a week. I learned a lot of what not to do, things like you pay people decent wages. That's important for diversity. You didn't do that. You only basically had rich white kids. You give people credit for the things that they do. You don't put some senior author's name on a project or something that you have written. So my early days were spent in that very, very early stages of the public interest world. Center for Responsive Law, Center for Auto Safety, and then I spent 5 to 7 years on Capitol Hill. That sort of took me back into my political work. And in 1983 or 84, I had the opportunity to be the founder of the Center for Responsive Politics, which was my first nonprofit. I went there. There was, I remember exactly, $40,000 in the checking account. And the very first thing I did was to buy an iMac. It's like, I cannot work anyplace without that. And that was, I don't know what it cost then, but it seemed like it was most of the money we had in the bank. I stayed at the Center for Responsive Politics for 14 years. I mean, we developed, and the CRP still exists today. Most of you may know it as opensecrets.org, became the premier organization for crunching numbers about money and politics, campaign finance primarily, and now in all of its many guises, lobbying information, revolving door information. And it was an incredibly eye-opening experience, not only for me, but for understanding the world of political money. As soon as we crunched the numbers, we realized, for example, the PACs were not the problem. Everybody was talking about reforming the PAC problem. But actually, much more money was coming through individuals. I learned a lot there. I mean, that was the first nonprofit that I had ever run. I must have learned some of these entrepreneurial skills from my family, since they were in the business world. But I also learned a lot along the way, you know, management skills, fundraising skills. You know, we had a team, you had a staff. And I really think that my role was more to reflect and coalesce the vision and make sure it got done and raise the money so everybody, you know, could eat and continue to come to work. I left the Center for Responsive Politics at the end of '96 and '97, started my second nonprofit organization called Public Campaign, organization which still exists today, an advocacy group on reform of the campaign finance system. Pure and simple. Very much moving not away from data and more into organizing. I mean, once you recognize that there is a substantial problem, you can't help as an entrepreneur to want to try to fix it. And that's where my work led me. What I realized was there was a big difference in being organized, which I was and I am, and being an organizer, which requires a lot more patience than I have, although I would say I have a fair amount of patience. And so I got that organization off the ground. They are doing stupendously well and still carrying on. Between those two early experiences, I learned a lot about how you staff an organization, how you manage an organization. And I would say none of it has ever been cookie cutter, but it's things that work between you and and the staff that you hire. So that in 2005, in the fall of 2005, when the opportunity to create the Sunlight Foundation came along, I really felt I had some practiced experience, both in terms of management and fundraising and the vision, which I think are all the three most important things you need as an entrepreneur.
Great, and so this actually goes a perfect segue into the Sunlight Foundation. So talk about why did you start Sunlight Foundation? What was sort of the aha moment? And what compelled you to start this foundation? Because you had two other nonprofits before, and then perhaps shed some light on the name Sunlight. Like, why did you name it Sunlight?
Great. So the Sunlight Foundation was not in my plan. I had been running two nonprofit organizations. I had founded and run two nonprofit organizations. And I was happily serving as the publisher for an early we called them a web zine at the time, something called tompaine.com. That was my first real internet experience. And I was approached by a Washington businessman, lawyer, who the very first thing he said to me was, I'm in the give back phase of my career. I think Washington is full of corrupt politicians and corrupt systems. What can be done about it? And Mike Klein knew of my background. And we talked a little bit about an idea he had about how do you incentivize reporting around political corruption, the impact at the state level and the federal level. And we talked with a lot of people who were doing political reporting, and they all said, hey, look, let's take it to the most basic level. If the data about political finance and lobbying and what they get from that, government grants and contracts and positions and advisory committees and on and on and on. If that was more accessible, we could write our stories. We could certainly convince our editors that we had a story. And so the data thing being kind of right up my alley, we talked with two people who have been my longtime both personal friends and advisors, Mika Sifry and Andrew Richey of the Personal Democracy Forum in New York. And they had been studying the relationship between technology and politics. But Mike and I were interested in technology and governance. And we sat down with Mika and Andrew, and they made a presentation. We brainstormed over it. And the very next day, Mike Klein wrote a check for $3.5 million. And he said, I'll be your seed funder. You run it. I said, it? I mean, I had a notepad of notes. I wasn't looking to run anything new. And he said, you'll figure it out. And that was about 8 years ago.
No, that's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, that is, how does it happen? Never happened to me like that before.
Well, I mean, if you could tell the secrets how to get a guy to write a $3 million check, let us know.
If I could figure it out, I'd do it again. But I'd be glad to share the information.
Right. Tweet it out when you do. So when I heard the Sunlight Foundation, I mean, obviously trying to figure out the programming, and then when your name came across, I was like, oh, what's the Sunlight Foundation? And as I was reading it, like, I go hiking a lot. So when I go hiking with my kids, when I think about sunlight, the Sunlight Foundation, I would think about, hey, I go to a rock, I lift it up, and then I see like cockroaches and like nasty bugs like scrambling. Right, so is that sort of an accurate visualization of what sunlight is?
We actually had an advertisement at the very beginning, exactly like that, precisely like that,
Okay.
shining a light in the corner of the Capitol. The name actually comes from a quote that Louis Brandeis, Supreme Court Justice, a Louisville native, as it turns out, something he said, which is that sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, electric light the most efficient policeman. When I first met Mike over lunch that day, he said, I'm a great believer in what Justice Brandeis said. Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. And I said, and I can finish the sentence for you. He said, really? I said, indeed, electric light the most efficient policeman. So we kind of knew in the back of our minds that Sunlight would be called the Sunlight Foundation. And when Sunlight was founded, I mean, truly, I had a yellow pad full of notes. We didn't know whether it was going to be a nonprofit grant-making organization. I think we knew it wouldn't be a for-profit as such. But we decided we would simply call it the Sunlight Foundation, and we would fill in the blanks. So it really is about shining the light on the dark corners, starting with the data, to get the cockroaches, out of our system. And I mean, I think there's just no question that when data and information is made available, that more people are accountable. So Sunlight's core mission is really about accountability and using the technology to advance that as a tool.
Right, that was great because I mean, you mentioned that you got the insight of Sunlight from the Personal Democracy Forum. We actually interviewed Andrew Richey, who runs that, last year in New York, and our chapter director there at the time asked him a question. He's like, what is your view of the government's view of technology? And then he had replied, he's like, well, that entity, they don't know the difference between a server and a
waiter.
Waiter, right. So I thought that was kind of funny.
Exactly. And I think that's pretty accurate, actually.
Right.
I mean, I think things have advanced since Andrew first said that in 2005 or 2006. But they haven't advanced as far and as fast as it should have.
Right. So that's interesting how Sunlight it's gotten like light years ahead to expose open data for everyone. So you're sort of trying to do their job, right? In a sense.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story about that. In the very early days of Sunlight, we did give a number of relatively large grants. Remind me to talk about our current grants program later. And one of the organizations we gave a grant to is a nonprofit in DC called OMB Watch, and it sounds very non-techy, but it's an organization that watches the federal government, particularly the regulatory process. They've now changed their name to Center for Effective Government. We gave this organization a grant, and I'll mention the amount. It was $320,000 to build the first publicly accessible database on government spending, which they did, and it was called fedspending.org, and it took them 4 or 5 months to get up a basic database on government spending, but it was the first publicly accessible database on government spending. Within a couple of months of the database going live, the then called Coburn-Obama bill mandating that the federal government create a federal database, federal publicly available database, passed. Long story in getting it passed, which I don't need to go into. And OMB purchased the license from the nonprofit to set up the first version of usaspending.gov. And literally, when that happened, a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, wait a minute, it is not our responsibility to create databases out of government information. It's government's responsibility. And I hired our policy director. Said, like, we have to make this happen. We will never have enough financing to create all the accessible data, forget whether it's a database or just accessible data. And so we hired a policy shop, and that was sort of the second piece of what Sunlight actually put into place after that experience.
Awesome. I want to probably skip to since we're already talking about this, but Sunlight has created 3-4 dozens tools out there already.
Yeah.
So
probably that many and killed about that many too.
Okay. But if you can explain, like, well, why don't you, in your opinion, what is the 5 most important tool that Sunlight has out there? Let's talk about that. Yeah.
Well, as a prelude to that, I want to say that Sunlight really did operate as a startup. I mean, we had this unbelievable luxury of core money our first year. And so, the first idea in the door, was to create, it wasn't a very good idea, as it turned out, was to create a wiki on Congress. Like, we just had to create something different. We called it Congresspedia. It no longer exists because it was really not a great idea, because we were going to try to create a cohort of people separate from those who go to Wikipedia to put information in about members of Congress, like, really not a great idea. But we had a bunch of other ideas that fortunately did pan out and work out quite well. But we wanted to act like a startup. We wanted to be able to come in with ideas, to do rapid development, to test them out, and if they weren't good, we wanted to kill them. We had trouble killing them because they were always somebody's baby, but last year, including whether they were my baby or not, a bunch of projects just disappeared. Currently, I think the most important thing we do is actually not a project at all. It's the fact that our APIs have been used over 1 billion times. So the data that we are serving is probably the most important thing that we do. That said, when you look at the tools we have built, using that data, a couple of favorites stand out. We have a site called Open States. I don't know if anybody in this room has ever heard of or ever used Open States. It is used more times than our seemingly more popular site called Open Congress. And we're talking about 350, 400,000 users a month for both of these sites. Open States is, to me, one of the most interesting things because it was a community-based project. We had volunteer developers scraping their state legislative sites. We put all of that information into a common data format, created a single site called Open States where you can search legislation across the horizon. And it is really interesting. So when you're looking for legislation, for example, I call it the Stand By Your Gun legislation that was of such notoriety in Florida, you can see exactly how many other states have introduced that piece of legislation, and whether it's literally word for word or whether phrase for phrase or how similar it is. It's an extremely useful tool, and it is very, very widely used. Open Congress would certainly be on the list in terms of very useful sites as well. Again, when we were approached to actually build this site, which we did initially jointly with the Participatory Politics Foundation, we've since taken it over, I thought, yeah, I really like that site. I don't know how popular it's going to be. I mean, it's pretty wonky, and how many people are going to use it. And we were shocked by the high usage of it. And when we built our Android app called Congress, not a really very sexy name, it's been downloaded something like 500,000 times. It's used 60 to 75,000 times a week. I don't know who you are that are using this, but
it's called Congress app.
It's called Congress app.
Okay, well, that explains it.
Really, I mean, it's not exactly a game out there. But I think we've operated very much in this: if you build it, they will come. But those are some of the key apps.
So now there's I know that in May 2012 you had unveiled this. Maybe not one of your popular ones, but it's called
it is actually
Polititwoops.
Polititwoops.
Okay, so this basically is
or Polititwoops.
Polititwoops, yeah.
I can't remember what we call
so
it.
it collects deleted tweets by U.S. politicians.
Yes.
Right. So you have any interesting ones you can share? Like.
I'd rather not share them,
Okay.
actually. There have been a lot of interesting ones, but they've been actually rather painful. Episodically, we will do something that is just a little bit silly and a little bit fun, and will get attention, I think, actually, for some of our more serious work. And I would put Polititwoops in this category. What's interesting is that the software that we didn't actually develop the software for Polititwoops. It was developed by a Dutch group. And it has been refined for some 20 countries around the world. So it is very popular. And perhaps it is what I refer to as a gateway drug for some of the more serious kind of work. But some of the things that we have found deleted are just kind of cringe-worthy. So it's not my favorite app, but we've done other things that have been sort of more fun.
Sure. Is there any other apps that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I think the one other one I should highlight is something called Scout. I mean, people in this room might find it really useful. It is a fantastic app. And it's really meant for people like me, like anybody who's following public policy in any dimension. And so this is a tailor-made, you tailor it, search. It can be keyword, it can be code section, it can be almost anything. And this is a site that scrapes things like the congressional record, all 50 state legislative sites, all of Congress, Thomas, and maybe a half a dozen other sources. So one of our colleagues in the beta testing phase put in FOIA, and he also put in the US code for FOIA. And the US code popped up something that was an amendment that was proposed to exempt, I believe it was the FDA or some agency, from some particular FOIA requirement. And we said, what is this? Now, we're not FOIA experts, so we went to the FOIA community. We said, what is this? And they said, oh, my God. And we actually alerted the Hill, some FOIA defenders on the Hill to that, and we stopped that piece of legislation or that amendment from happening. So this is a really free and easy way. You can create collections for yourself and for your communities, and it's really quite a phenomenal site. It's very well used also.
Okay, great. I know that a lot of these apps that you have created have an undertone of data, what we call influence data. So can you explain to us what influence data and what it is and why it's so important to Sunlight?
Sure. At the heart of Sunlight's work, because that's how Mike Klein and I sort of really conceived of Sunlight, was to shed a new light on the role of money in politics, the role of lobbying, but to go far beyond than just calculating what the dollars and cents of that, or the tens of millions of dollars of cents and cents of that are, but to illustrate what does the money buy? What does it get? I mean, people were alleging a lot of things, but if you couldn't connect the dots from campaign contribution at the federal level to the state level, to the lobbying at the federal level, at the state level, to the grants and the contracts, and to the advisory committee positions, to whether anybody's ever been sanctioned by the EPA, how much they pay in taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, endless numbers of dots to be connected, then you really don't have the story, and you don't have a data-filled story. You just have conjecture. And so the original vision, as we described it, was to create a data commons to begin to dump all kinds of data that would tell the story of Washington and every state capital and likely every municipality in the country as well. The data commons became known as Influence Explorer. It is one of our core sites. It is really sort of the heart of my interest. We build a lot of things on top of it, as well as have a user interface on it for most folks. But for me, the reason to follow this is it is the story of our politics. It is the story of how policy is made. It's not a pretty story. It is a complex story. And if we can tell it through data, it will make it easier for people to understand.
Right. And so, I mean, you sort of touched upon it a little bit, but, money is always the root of all evil. So, I mean, you follow the spending data. I know I've seen past videos of where, I wish we had a screen so you can sort of demo
it's all right.
the apps that you guys created. But it's interesting where you say, okay, let's look at General Electric, right, and see how much they contributed and who did they contribute to, and here are their EPA violations, and it's like everything about GE.
Yeah, I wish it were everything about GE, but it really does tell a story through data. So if you're on influenceexplorer.com and you type in General Electric and you scroll down the page, you just see this data, the lobbying data, the campaign finance data, the EPA data, the violations data, and then you see sort of the input, and then you see the output, government grants, government contracts, positions, positions on advisory committees. It is a story without words. It is a story in data. Obviously, we need reporters, we need journalists to tell this story, to develop the narratives for people who are not as steeped in it as people at Sunlight are. But this is absolutely core to what we need. Our interest in data, though, morphed into more than just the input, the money, power, and politics side of it, to all open data, all open government data. And we launched very quickly. I would say we latched onto, or we began to take the administration at its word after Obama was elected, and he said this would be the most transparent administration in history. We said, show us the data, give us the data, and we will understand more, we can ask more intelligent questions. It's been an uphill battle, frankly.
Okay, no, that's a good segue to our next segment, which is challenges of transparency in data. But before I say that, make sure you guys tweet out #StartupGrind at Ellen Miller, ELLNMLLR. Okay. So, what do you think is? You've said in the past the biggest challenges of transparency is accuracy, right? So you can have a transparent data, but if it's not accurate, it's pretty meaningless. Yeah. So. Let's talk about how do you tackle that challenge and make the government.
Let's talk about accuracy.
Sure, okay.
I don't think that's actually the biggest challenge, but let's talk about accuracy, and then we can talk about what I think is the biggest challenge.
One of the biggest challenges.
Accuracy is really, really a problem. So we've had an ongoing project for many years now to look at usaspending.gov, which we had some responsibility for helping to create. And so that's the website where you can monitor all government spending, grants, and contracts. So our team looked at there are two sources of data that go into usaspending.gov. And when you compare source A to source B, we have discovered that there is $1.3 trillion worth of errors in the data. It's like, that's real money. We have no idea, and nor does the federal government, know whether data source A is right, or B is right, or A is right half the time, and B is right a third of the time. Nobody knows. So basically what you see on USA Spending is really a guesstimate. We have talked many, many times with the administration about this problem. They are well aware of it, and either they can't fix it or they won't fix it. We've done the analysis 2, 3, 4 times, still the same exact problems every time. And we work very closely with the conservatives in Congress on this particular issue to try to solve. We very much are in agreement on this, that this is really a problem. We need to get a grip on this. So, it's the garbage in, garbage out problem.
How many of you are here are government contractors or small business contractor, government contractors? How many of you guys have used USspending.gov? Yeah, that's a very I use it all the time actually. When I used to own a government contractor firm myself, and we used to look at our competitions through there to see what kind of contracts are won by so and so. So it's very important to have accurate data.
So for all the details on this, look at Clear Spending. I think it's .org. That's our pretty much annual analysis. I think we've pretty much decided we're not going to do it anymore because it seems to be having no impact, other than helpfully passing a piece of legislation. But let me get back to what I think is the biggest problem. And this is really an insight from one of our key board members, Esther Dyson, who is she's been an unbelievable advisor, as I'm sure you can all imagine. Esther said that Sunlight's challenges were really twofold. The first one was to get government to do what it doesn't want to do. Information is power. We want information. They don't want to give it up. I mean, that is just as fundamental as anything you can imagine in the political sphere. But the second challenge is that we have to find a way to engage citizens who have been turned off and have become, rightfully, I would say, cynical about whether government really cares about them. Both of them are really tough. We, on the first challenge, our desire was to work closely with the administration, hold them to the letter of their promises about making data open and accessible. I would say for the first 9 months of the administration, we did work very closely with them. And then when the government agencies were supposed to put out their first high-value data sets, as they were described, we looked at those lists and we said, what are you talking about? The Interior Department, this is right around the time of the major BP oil spill. The Interior Department decided that one of its top high-value data sets was something called the wild horse and burrow count. I'm not kidding. This is I said, really? You have a lot of information about mining and minerals and all kinds of things. And for the Interior Department, the wild horse and burrow count was the best you could come up with? So we said to the administration, hey, look, you have a choice. You can criticize the agencies. And most of the other agencies did slightly better, but only slightly better. We said, you have a choice. You can criticize the agencies for not following your directive to put out high-value data sets. You can criticize them, or we will criticize you. And we ended up by criticizing them because they were afraid that if they criticized the agencies would just shut down. There were no new laws passed requiring this, so it was all voluntary. It's still all voluntary. And frankly, it's been a huge both hit or miss. And there's not that much data that's out there. There's a lot of data which we have found that has been hidden in broad daylight. You have no idea that it's there. We stumble across it.
What?
I knew you were going to ask me that as soon as I raised it. We did a series of blog posts about 3 or 4 years ago with a journalist who would dig for data and could find it, but it's not in machine readable format. It's there, but nobody can actually use it. And the early days of the administration, we said, don't even think about building apps. We have one thing to say to you. We said in every meeting we went to, and we went to a lot of meetings, give us the data in machine readable formats, beginning and end of story. But then they decided they wanted to create fun, sexy little apps. And of course, we didn't know whether we could trust the data. And it turns out in many cases, we couldn't trust the data. Not because they were playing with the data, it was just because the data is bad.
Now, that's interesting how you talk about non-readable machine language or whatever that is.
Yeah.
What's your opinion
PDFs.
about? Yeah, PDF. Well, I was going to say that. What is your opinion about FOIA? Because have anybody done a FOIA request? So FOIA is Freedom of Information Act, and so if you ask, I don't know, so a bid, and I'd like to know how this bid was decided or whatever it may be, right? FOIA.
Right.
They always they return it to you in in a scanned PDF form where you can't even scan it, right? You can't scan the text. It's an actual
If you get it back,
Right.
you might get it.
So
that way.
I wanted to ask you. So what's your
I have
opinion about
lots
FOIA?
of thoughts
sure. Okay.
about FOIA. So FOIA is a really, really important law. However, what it did was to put the burden of having government information in the public sector on the back of citizens. So if you want something, you ask the government, and they decide whether you can have it, even if it's public information. If you think about it very long, it's really backwards. Government should have a policy of proactively disclosing information. I will cut some slack and say there are things that should be secret. We can talk about that later. There are things that should be private. But government should have a proactive responsibility for putting out government data. It shouldn't be on the backs of citizens. So that said, FOIA is really important. We've gotten a lot of important information, under the Freedom of Information Act. But it's completely backwards, and that's all about changing the culture of government. In fact, FOIA is very slow. It's non-electronic. It's a disaster.
Everything's redacted too, right?
And then things, of course, the most important things get redacted. Right. You may have gotten it back in an unreadable PDF, but one day we got a little floppy disk like this back. We took a picture of it. We blogged about it. I mean, no one had a computer that would fit this little tiny floppy disk.
That's brilliant, actually.
Huh?
Put it in a format that people can't even read.
Yeah.
That's information there.
Yeah, exactly. We had a good laugh over that, needless to say. But this is the FOIA process is something the administration has also promised to fix, and they've been very, very slow in fixing it. But we should live in a world where data is proactively put forward and only the minimum is withheld for true national security or true privacy reasons. Representative Steve Israel from New York has introduced a piece of legislation that would flip our system. The bill is called POIA,
I was going to say POIA, right.
P-O-I-A, right, which is the Public Online Information Act. And if that bill were to be passed, and there's no sign of that happening at the moment, but it would require that all documents that are documents and data that are required to be made publicly available be made available online, beginning and end of story. But conceptually, that's the direction I think that the country needs to go.
That's interesting because it seems like everything's all on SharePoint or something. So I don't know. It should be an easy switch for them to internal to external, right?
I don't think everything. That is precisely the way it should be, and
right.
We don't know how much is available in that fashion.
So let's talk about data that should be open that isn't. Let's talk about the NSA surveillance program. How much of that data should be open? So national security, how much of that should be open to public eyes?
We need to have enough national security data open so that we can hold the agencies that are responsible for collecting it accountable. I cannot tell you chapter and verse what that is. It's not our particular expertise. But when you have none of that data available, we cannot hold those agencies accountable, I think, as we have very clearly seen in the Snowden case.
Right. I was going to say, so Snowden case, what should have been sort of like an open data?
I can't answer that
sure,
in terms
okay.
of the specifics.
Okay.
But what we know is there has to be enough data from the intelligence agencies so that the people can actually hold the agencies accountable.
Okay. I want to go to our. So I think this is our last segment. So this is our almost near the end. But let's talk about how folks here can get involved with Sunlight. I know that you've done a lot of community outreach, and Sunlight Foundation is the producer of Transparency Camp. You have those events. I've been to actually one of those events. It's actually really awesome. Can you talk about, so let's talk about the next Transparency Camp, that, when that's going to be, and then how can we get involved?
Terrific.
Sunlight, yeah.
Well, Transparency Camp is a great way to start getting involved with Sunlight. It's our annual event. It's the only event we have. It's I would say, organized unconference. When unconferences started to become the thing, my staff wouldn't let me go to one because, as I said earlier, I'm really organized, so an unorganized unconference would be my worst nightmare. So there's some structure to it, but basically it's an unconference. You come, you talk about what you want to talk about. It has a fantastically diverse and interesting community, everything from policy wonks, people who work inside government, people who are data focused, lots of developers, lots of hackers who are there, lots of startup people are there. The conferences, I think last year was our biggest. It was just under 500. We're actually hoping to pull it back just a little bit this year because the bigger it gets, the more organized it has to be. And we really want to have the unconference feeling to it. So it's a great introduction. It's May 31st, Friday the 31st and 1st this year. And it'll be held at the George Mason Conference. And we have some little flyers, little cards, someplace in the back. So do pick up one of those. So that's a great way to get introduced to the community. We've always been very community-minded, and that has been led by Sunlight Labs, which is our technical division. This is one thing that sets the Sunlight Foundation as a nonprofit apart in Washington, which is that we have our own development team of 15 developers. We have 3 designers. They are on staff. They are beholden to Sunlight and to the products that we develop. It's really an incredible luxury and fantastic team.
And why don't you talk about how I heard Code for America came out of one of these transparency camps. I mean, Code for America is huge. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, it did. It did.
How did that come about? It's amazing.
It was, because of the people who were sitting in the room, including, I think, Jen Palka was there. I think Tim O'Reilly might have been there, some of the first conferences. And Transparency Camp is a place where ideas happen. So not only did Code for America come from there, and then that idea sort of gestated, and it became one of Sunlight's early mini grant programs. We gave them their first $10,000.
You have a mini grant?
Do we have a mini grant?
Yeah, you have a grant? Like you have, it sounds like accelerator sort of fund.
It is, we do.
Okay, we'll talk a little more about that because I'm sure some folks here are interested
in
that.
All right, good. Okay, so anyway, out of Transparency Camp came city camps as well, all around the country. We helped, with small contributions to fund those as well. And so it is a place where ideas hatched or where ideas are tried out, and you can do your own sessions. Sunlight does have a grant program. We've had actually a larger one, which we now have shut down, and we have something called OpenGov grants. These are really for civic innovations. They are, I would say, pre-friends and family. This is, my favorite grants of these. There's one called Turbo Vote. 2 graduate students at Harvard Business School came up with an idea for absentee voting. And they said, basically, we need $5,000 to test this out at Boston University. We said, fine. Gave them a check for $5,000.
But how did you hear about them? Did they just submit that on your website?
They submitted that on our website. I think that's right. Because we used to call it the mini grant program. And so our grants are specifically for civic innovations that need to get from the idea or the graduate school project or the project that's come out of your living room to a proof of concept. That's all you can do with $5,000 or $10,000. And if that is successful, then I have been known to pick up the telephone and call other funders and say, hey, this is a really cool project you ought to take a look at. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't work. One of our most exciting ones is one called Turbo Vote. Been very, very successful and has moved up the chain. I still do tease my good friend Alberto Ibarguen at the Knight Foundation, which is very into civic innovation, that we're a feeder for them. They funded several of these that we have now funded. And Knight itself actually has a prototype fund. I think they give in the $35,000, $30,000 to $50,000 range. Okay. It shows the difference in assets between the Knight Foundation and Sunlight Foundation. But I would urge everyone, come to the Sunlight Foundation, sunlightfoundation.com, look for a tab that says grants. It's a long URL. I apologize for that. But
I can put it on our post-event right up.
There's a one-page application. We will not make you go very far into it. We'll take a look at it. We meet monthly, so we basically have rolling decisions, and we'll let you know right away. It's not that difficult for us to give $5,000 away.
No, I mean,
Up to
that's
10.
great. Up to 10, that's great. So let's talk about the future of Sunlight Foundation. I read on your blog that you're going to retire at the end of this year.
That is my full intent.
So that's your full intent. So how many social entrepreneurs do we have here? Raise your hand. Okay, keep your hands raised.
Good.
So what should they put on the resume that you're looking for the next executive director for Sunlight Foundation?
Well, I think there are 3 qualities that we're looking for. I mentioned them earlier. A vision for what the Sunlight Foundation could become. Even though we're no longer really technically a startup, we still like to think about that the next executive director will say, this is what we've done, this is where we want to go. The board is very, very open to that. So vision. Some fundraising skills, either practiced and proven, or willingness to learn with the right kind of emphasis and team behind. You don't have to you don't have to have raised millions of dollars. It doesn't hurt. But the board is very open to looking at that. And then management, I think, would be the last. Sunlight is a good-sized team. We have 50 people. Everyone has a different management style, but some experience in terms of management. Those are, for me, the top 3 qualities. And I put vision, fundraising, and management. But I'm not the decider.
Sure, no problem. So for the folks who don't get in as the executive director, what sort of concepts and principles should they be keeping in mind while they're running their own social startup?
Vision.
So,
I mean, I think vision is absolutely key. And a good eye for hiring. I don't know when I sort of figured this out, but I figured out pretty quickly that you hire to your weakness. You hire to complement the skills that you bring. So, my weakness, I couldn't code my way out of a paper bag. I can barely rip my way out of a paper bag. So obviously, I needed to make Sunlight a successful operation, a very strong tech team, and it's phenomenal. It's really phenomenal. But these are developers who have a passion about government, about what makes for a better democracy, about how you engage people, how we use technology, and try to deliver on the promise. And I think it's still a promise of how technology can be used for engagement. So hiring to your weakness, bringing that on. Having a strong stomach for fundraising. I mean, it is not easy, whether it is in the private VC world, or it is in the foundation world, or whether it is looking for wealthy individuals. It brings all kinds of challenges. But I think the fundraising comes to people who have 2 proven qualities. One is vision, to say it for the 10th time, and the second one is the ability to execute. And I think that's one of the strong things that I have brought, which is I've been able to hire really good people. We have really been able to deliver, often early, often overpromised products. And I think those are absolutely key things. And another thing I think, and this is, I never had the following before, which is about half of Sunlight's funding in the past has come in core funding. It has not been project driven. And because the nature of Sunlight is we have policy work, we have investigative reporting work, we have tool building work. Some of that can be projectized. But to have the core funding means that you can jump on something when someone does walk in with that idea and you think it is truly the best thing since sliced bread and we've got to do it. And you have the luxury to fail on those things, some of our products have failed and some have not. Some that have been even more thoughtfully designed, haven't worked out. And so one of the things that we're focusing now, and I would urge people to look at, is the whole field of human-centric design, user-centric design. Without that, we're just shooting blanks, and we really can't afford to do that much anymore.
So we're going to open up the floor to Q&A. So do we have, first of all, do we have City Pass members that have questions? Okay, just making, oh yeah, that's right. Okay, here you go.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, thank you for coming tonight. Stand up. Yeah.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Volker Sorger. I'm a professor at GW, and I didn't count exactly how many times the word data was mentioned. I would maybe guess 50 times or so.
Maybe more than vision.
Maybe more. I don't know. It's like something on this order, right? So, what's your take on the buzzword big data, and how maybe are you already executing that at Sunlight maybe? And what's your vision? Where do you see big data can go and can help? Thank you.
Good question, and I don't know that I have a full answer to it. I think of the term big data as something that Sunlight is not actually involved in. For me, and this may be inaccurate, for me the term big data implies data about all of us, the data about all of us that is used to serve up ads, that it's more on the sort of the for-profit side of things. Sunlight is actually in a world of a fairly small data. It's government data, but it's data that's collected by the government. And so it's, we're looking here at data, and big data is someplace out there, and it's not quite what we are really focused on.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Miraj. I'm with a startup company in Florida called ABM Engineering. And we do government contracts, and you had mentioned that USAspending.gov, which I've looked at many a times, is not a good place to go because there's a lot of discrepancies. I might have missed it, but what's a good place where I can get some clear numbers?
Your question was, is there a place you can go and get clear numbers?
Yeah, other than USA spending.
No, it is the best. It is the best that exists. And it's not good. I mean, that's where we found the $1.3 trillion worth of errors.
Okay, next question. I think we're going to do maybe two more questions.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Ben Reich. I'm a big data software engineer. So you said, maybe Sunlight Foundation isn't involved in big data with that title, but surely there's a lot of data. And one thing I've seen in the big data world is that it's easy or possible to spin a lot of data into any narrative. You talked a lot about how some of your sites and tools allow you to view data as a narrative. Are you guys sensitive to not trying to bias the narrative or tell a particular narrative that you guys have decided, or is that part of the mission of the Sunlight Foundation to tell a particular story? Just sometimes you see that with a big enough data set, you could tell the opposite.
Any story. Yeah. Sunlight, I should have said this right at the very beginning. Sunlight is a nonpartisan organization. And so our job is not to spin the data, it's to let the data tell the story. If we are pre-selecting certain data and it feels like we're trying to tell a story, it's accidental, and it's certainly not deliberate.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, my name is Pejman. I'm with iTalk Cloud Solutions. Where else in the world do we have a governance transparency method that we can look up to? I mean, I'm assuming this is not the first time a human nation wanted to tackle this challenge. And what is an interesting story that you can say about that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I didn't talk about our global work. I didn't really talk about our municipal work, which is where I think our strength is and where we're moving in the future. The answer to your question is that in some respects, the US has led in terms of the rhetorical promise of open data, but the UK has probably done more to actually release data than we have. We've started something called, the US started something called the Open Government Partnership, which I believe 68 countries around the world have now endorsed. And I think the work of the US in this case has been catalytic, but again, the promise has yet to be fulfilled. I mean, every country in the world, every government in the world understands what I said earlier, that information is power. and they're trying to figure out, how to make their government more accountable because citizens are demanding it. At the same time, they don't want to give away too much power. But this is now a global phenomenon, and in the US, a municipal phenomenon where we're seeing far more willingness to engage with the people. That we're seeing mayors who really want to open the data to improve their communities. And because all politics is local, I think we're seeing a lot more progress and a lot more uptake on adopting principles that we've been working on for open data at the municipal level.
Okay, so we always ask one last question. I have two last questions. Two, but I think you already answered this one, but I'll ask it again. If you could turn back time 15 years ago, and you were sitting here in the audience, sitting in front of a badass social entrepreneur, what kind of advice would you have given yourself?
What would I have given myself? I mean, working as I have in the policy, particularly in the policy arena, so I don't know how clear this is, I think it's really important to recognize what your role is and whether you're an inside player or an outside player. And because our data work is really about opening government data to hold it accountable, I think it's really important to be an outside player and not get sucked into the nighttime events, the nighttime parties, and to operate as an independent, actor. And so that's definitely one piece of advice. And I think the other piece of advice is, once you are an entrepreneur, whether you're a business entrepreneur or a social entrepreneur, you are always an entrepreneur. That's why people say to me, "What are you going to do? What am I going to do are you really going to retire?" And I still insist that I intend to retire. And people say, "I'll believe it when I see it." Because I think once you have that in your genes and you begin to, and you've experienced at least some modest success, that will inspire you to move on and on. I'm done creating nonprofits. Of that I am absolutely sure.
Okay, and then the last question we always ask, probably the most important question, who is your favorite superhero or historic figure, and why?
Well, I think I was raised after superheroes became a thing. So I'm going to go with Louis Brandeis, Supreme Court Justice, as I mentioned earlier, born in Louisville. He was a very controversial nominee for the Supreme Court. And Justice Douglas at the time said the reason he was so intimidating was that he really believed in fair and equal representation, and he was incorruptible. And so for all of those reasons, he is my superhero.
Okay, so we always ask you beforehand so we could prepare somewhat of a speaker's gift. I didn't have time, so usually what we'll do is we'll get, I'll usually go on to eBay and look for something, of your, your historic figure.
Yes.
But we didn't have time, so I actually went to Kinko's and printed something out, and they gave me two sizes. They said medium or large, so I picked the large, and this is what it came out to.
Oh, I love it.
So this is Chief Justice.
I love it.
Sunlight said to be the best infectant, electrical light to be the most efficient policeman. So that's what she said. Here you go.
And that's fantastic.
Okay,
It's
ladies and
really-
gentlemen, Ellen Miller,
okay.
thank you for coming out.
Thank you. Thank you all. That's awesome. This is going to have a wonderful place in our office.